Hello.
Oh, hi.
Okay.
Hello. Okay.
Okay. Hi. My name is Nina Smilow. I am a Sarah Lawrence MFA student. And I'm going to be talking with you today about telling stories.
Okay. Hi. My name is Nina Smilow. I am a Sarah Lawrence MFA student. And I'm going to be talking with you today about telling stories.
So, sorry, I'm still figuring this out. Anyway, hi. So today we're going to talk about telling stories. And when I say that, I'm referring to the idea of storytelling as a form of individual sharing of history. In the novel Homegoing, there's a quote that says, "History is storytelling." And that is what we're going to try and achieve here today, is thinking about the best possible way for you to tell your story. And that has to do with many, many things. So that's a question of tone. It's a question of narrative structure. And it's a question of the story itself. So there are some people out there who probably think that they are good storytellers. And there are people out there who think that they're bad storytellers, or who think that they don't have a story to tell. And the truth is that neither of those is ever entirely accurate, right? So we're going to talk over the next few weeks about the different kinds of stories that you can tell and the different ways to tell them. And if anybody here listens to any storytelling platforms like The Moth, which is going to be an example we come to a lot, or if you watch any stand-up is in itself a form of storytelling. So that is what we're going to work with. I am still figuring some of this out. So we are going to see if we can look at some examples together of telling stories. Today we're focusing mostly on how to tell a story using humor. The obvious examples of that are things like stand-up, but we're going to focus on two examples from The Moth today, because I think one of them is a good example of something that does not inherently seem like a good story. And the other does not inherently seem like a story that would be humorous in its actual events. And yet both, I think, end up really achieving that aim of not only telling a story well, but telling it in a way that is humorous. So let me see. Hold on 1 second. What I can do. Okay. So I'm going to share my screen.
How about a big hand for James Foster, everybody?
Let's see. Okay. So this is the first story that we're going to look at. Sorry, hold on. The first story that we're going to look at today is the bad haircut. And while watching this story, I want everybody to consider what is literally happening in it. Not necessarily the way it's told, not necessarily sort of the attitude the speaker comes to with it, but literally what is happening in this story. So let's watch it together.
Okay, so I'm in 4th grade, going to 5th grade, and it's the end of the summer, and I'm getting ready for school. And I got my school supplies, my school clothes, my super cool new lunchbox, the new J's on my feet, you know, the new Jordan sneakers. I'm set. There's only really one thing I'm missing. And you know how, like, when you're a kid, you don't really care how your hair looks? Like, you don't really take care of your hair. Like, you don't really comb it or wash it. Or maybe that's just me. So at the end of the summer, my hair was kind of just like this thing on my head. And it was terrible. It was revolting. Like, nobody wanted to look at it. And so everywhere I'm going, my friends are like, yo, Alfonso, you need a haircut. My sister is telling me you need a haircut, you know. My mom's kind of corny. She said, I'm going to get you a haircut before you go to school because you look like a fool. You know, that's what she said. And so one day, and I'm kind of just like, yeah, you know, I agree. I need a haircut. So one day I go to my cousin's house, and it's my older cousin and my other cousin around my age. And so I'm sitting there, I'm playing video games with my other cousin around my age, and while I'm playing video games, I kind of notice my older cousin kind of staring at my hair. And all of a sudden he says, you know, I could cut your hair right for free. And I'm like, really? Really? Because that'd be great. My mom's been she said I need a haircut before I go back to school. So this would be awesome. And so I didn't really know better. Like, nobody was there to say, stop. This guy is not a licensed barber. He's not qualified to cut hair. This is not what he does. It's just not. And so my cousin takes me to the backyard, to the garage. And the garage is dark, and there's not really much light except for this old rusty lamp. And you know how, like, in the movies, when they find some ancient artifact and there's the dust on it, they blow it and the dust fly everywhere? That was that lamp. That was it. So my cousin, you know, starts cutting my hair. There was no mirrors either, you know. And you know how like when you go to a barbershop, there's those giant mirrors. So while you're getting your haircut, you could kind of look up and check, you know, I like that. That's nice. You know, there was nothing. So my cousin's cutting my hair for like 25, 30 minutes. And all of a sudden, he stops. And he's proud of his work. He's like, bang, there you go. I got you, little man. Gives me a high five. Got you. And I get up, and, you know, I'm like, okay, now I'm ready for school. You know, I want to go play video games with my cousin now. And so I knew there was something wrong. Because as soon as I stepped foot into the house, my other cousin around my age looks at me and starts dying, crying, laughing all over the place, hysterically. And I like jokes, you know, I want to know what's funny too. So I go to the bathroom and I come face to face with the mirror. I couldn't believe what I saw, guys. My hairline was back here. And this was all shining. Like, I had like this windshield thing going on. Like, if you look closely enough into my forehead, you can see your own reflection in it. It was crazy. It was just glistening. And I was kind of crazy when I was a kid. So I started bugging out all over the place. You know, I'm screaming everywhere. Why? What am I going to do? Oh my God, cousin, why have you wronged me this way? How am I supposed to go to school? What am I going to do? So later on, I get dropped off at my house and I see my mom. And she looks at me and she kind of just like shrugs it off, you know. She's like, oh, well, you know, I told you I was going to get you a haircut. Should have waited, now you're going to look funny. And so that's what happened. I looked funny for the first 2 to 3 weeks of school. People laughed and made jokes. And I don't know if y'all can tell, I keeps it fresh now. So basically, I trusted my cousin once, and I will never trust him again for anything.
Okay. So the what happened of that story is just somebody getting a bad haircut. And I think it's important to note that that is not necessarily the way that you might think you're about to start a really great story. It doesn't have necessarily a large action sequence. It doesn't have any really dramatic turns, and yet it becomes a complete narrative and one that really incorporates humor. So now we're going to talk about the ways that that story achieves that end, which is one is he gives it a beginning, a middle, and an end. So the beginning is the presentation of I looked ridiculous, I needed a haircut, right? And that allows our action to rise. The middle, and this is a little bit open to interpretation, but the middle seems to me to be where his cousin offers to give him a haircut. Because from that point on, the decision to say yes to that leads to the end of the story, which is, as his mom put it, looking silly, having this bad haircut. So your story itself, the pitch of it, the one-line synopsis, does not necessarily need, especially in the case of humorous stories, to be immediately enticing. It matters that you are going to give it a complete action, a beginning, a middle, and an end. It doesn't even necessarily need to deviate, right? The story is called The Bad Haircut, so we know what's going to happen. We know going into it, and we'll deal with expectations in our next example in a moment. But this story also has the conflict and resolution, right? The conflict of the hair being bad and the resolution of sort of him no longer doing that, him maintaining his haircuts now and valuing them. But the second thing that I really think provides this anecdote with a storytelling aspect is the characters. He does a really great job of creating the character of his mom, right? Giving her little sort of catchphrases and telling her she's corny, of his cousin, and of himself. And once you have really clear characters in storytelling, much like in a novel, you can sort of make them do anything. You can throw them into any situation and they will provide entertainment. So in your story, you want to make sure that you're very clear on who's there, on who those characters are, even if it's you. He also sets place really well, right? Because often when we talk about a story being funny, what do we say? We say you had to be there. So what does he do when he talks about his cousin cutting his hair? He puts us there. He describes the scene very clearly so that you can imagine being in that room and the very old scissors and know that it's probably not going to go well, right? The anticipation. And that is an element of foreshadowing that works really well in humor too, because the payoff is when the audience feels like they knew this was going to be a bad idea. They knew this was going to be a dangerous event. And then their expectations are met in a way that provides comedic relief. So the second story we're going to watch and pay attention to really plays with foreshadowing insofar as the storyteller is going to tell us what happens and then the story plays out. So I want you to keep in mind everything that we just learned looking at Bad Haircut, which is this idea of character, of place setting, But now think even more about the idea of hints, right? Hints, foreshadowing, and even more with the idea of why a story can be humorous. Because we sort of talked about with Bad Haircut, this idea that it's not necessarily an exciting story, and yet a story that's lacking in excitement can be humorous. Now it's the idea of a story that is not in its pitch funny as humorous. So let's take a look.
James Foster, everybody. Good evening, everyone. Thank you. My story has to do with a 1996 Grand Marquis Mercury.
Yeah.
That I picked up from my father when he bought a new car. I got it when my daughter was in high school so that I could have a second car to get her to and from school. And we had a brief relationship. I got this car about 5 years ago, and it was pretty reliable. But the main part of the story has to do with the time that I got the car stolen and how I got the car stolen. I live in Detroit. I've been a lifelong Detroit resident. I'm third generation Detroit. I'm not even being scammed. I've seen panhandlers and people trying to get you in the gas station for a couple of bucks. But this guy was good. This guy was real good. He got it. I'm loading tools in the car to go with my dad to do a little work. Guy comes up and says, "Can you help me?" I right away say no. No, I got a couple bucks. I just need you to give me a ride over and get my car a jump. Now, most of the time, people are trying to scam you. They don't have $2 in their hand offering it to you. So I listened. He said his van broke down. He's just around the corner on the freeway, off the lodge. He just needs a jump. And give me a couple. I said, "Oh, okay. Maybe this time I'll do the guy thing." So he gets in the car with me, drive around. There was actually a van there. Okay, so it makes a little bit more sense. The hood's up on the van. I said, okay, I've got jumper cables. I figured, 30 seconds, I'm going on with my life. Raise the hood of my car. He gets in the van. He fools around. Nothing's happening with the van, even with the cables up. So we're sitting there for a while trying to get the car started. Finally, he says, "You tried to start the van." I'll tinker under the hood while you try to start the van. Because I know the van. I should be able to start. I'm a little leery, but the hood's up on my car. It's got jumper cables on it. I figured what could happen. So, running line service drive, I'm trying to, turn the key in the van. And as I look down, it's not really a key. It's a screwdriver in the ignition of the van. A little suspicious, but he offered me a couple dollars. So then he gets very concerned. He says, "These people sure are flying up the service drive. Maybe you better pull your car off to the side while we try to figure out what's wrong with the van." So he says, you take the cables off and then I'll move your car. The hood's up on the car. I'm outside the car. I say, okay. I take the cables off. I see my car going northbound on this side. With the hood up. With the hood up. He makes it all the way to the forest entrance to the Lodge Freeway. Stops, puts the hood down. Now, please do recover the car a few weeks later, minus the catalytic converter. Yeah. The aluminum wheels. Even take the visors off from, the block the sun. But I got the last laugh. Thanks to President Obama and Casper Bumpers. Got the 4,500.
Okay. So, in this story, right, much like in the first one, we know what's going to happen. Unlike in the first story, the stakes are a little higher, right? Inherently, if I tell you, I'm going to tell you a story about the time my car got stolen, that does not immediately sound like it's going to be a funny story. And yet, right away, we're sort of put at ease. And I think it's because of a few things. One is the great thing about storytelling is, especially when we do it verbally, is that we get to really indicate mood. And this storyteller's mood indicates that it's all going to be fun, right? They don't start in a very grave place. So that's something to think about. If you're going to tell a story where you make sure the ending is clear, you want to make sure you convey the mood of that ending, especially if you're going for a humorous bent on the story. And then there are two storytelling constructs here that I think make a big difference and allow for this to be a really funny story. One is, as I said earlier, the idea of sort of foreshadowing. And that's achieved in the storyteller's explanation of themselves, right? When they talk about being a Detroit native, they talk about not being taken advantage of easily, but we already know that this is a story about their car getting stolen. So our expectations is already that although he is telling us this about himself, this is going to get proven false. So he's foreshadowing that he had this confidence and that it was proven incorrect. There are a lot of hints during it, right? Some are noted in the way that he tells the story, sort of the questioning of everything. And some are just noted, even if I wrote this story down, this idea of sort of like, oh, well, the guy had $2, so I figured it was fine. And we in the audience know, because we know that it ends with his car getting stolen, that that's kind of a misdirect. The second thing is that he calls back to stuff a lot, right? He uses that $2 as a reference later in the story to say, so it had to be fine, he had $2. And we know right from the get-go, right from when that $2 were introduced, that it is not a guarantee that everything's fine because we know his car got stolen. So one of the things about storytelling that I think is different than writing a story is it relies on some theatrical devices. If you're just writing a story, you may want to save the greatest part of the action, which is the car being stolen, for the end, right? That might work out differently. That might work out effectively. For the sake of a storytelling medium, it's good to have your audience's expectation meet up with yours so that things like the $2 become a hint for them and something that you are reacting to with them. So audience, even if it's something being read, is important to consider when dealing with storytelling. And I think this is also a good example because if you waited until the end to reveal that the car got taken and you told this whole story about sort of really trying to help someone and putting your faith in them and looking for all of these hints that it would be okay, and then it ends with your car getting stolen, that's not necessarily a funny story. You can see it sort of being much more of a sad lesson to be learned. So he has to achieve a humorous tone. And in this particular case, I think he does that by telling us what's going to happen, right? And then building the narrative around what happens. So the first story, The Bad Haircut, I think is an example of a story that is not inherently entertaining, right? Getting a bad haircut is not necessarily a story that immediately grabs attention. And yet he achieves that through giving it a real narrative structure, that beginning, middle, end, and building really strong characters in place. This story is one that is not inherently funny, but the storyteller makes it funny by letting us in on the joke, so telling us what's going to happen, and then giving a lot of hints and foreshadowing and callbacks. And then also, of course, developing character, although with less sort of voice work than in the first story, and more setting of the scene. But even then, we get a lot more of the sort of tangible details of the scene and the character in the first story. And I think that's because this story has a more clear action to it, and then it's about crafting it in a humorous light. So we're going to take a moment here and think of 3 stories from your life, or because this is storytelling and it doesn't have to necessarily be entirely accurate, maybe it's a story of someone you know or someone in your family, something funny that happened to your dad or your sister. And like with the second story, it doesn't necessarily have to be an obviously funny story. Maybe it's something not funny that happened in a funny way. Maybe it's something boring that was actually really, really funny. But think of about 3 examples. And then you're going to take those 3 examples and you're going to give them a narrative structure. So you're going to give them a beginning, a middle, and an end. So you set the scene, create the conflict, take us through to where the action rises, and then show us how it ends. So you have 3 story ideas, and you've given them their beginning, middle, and end. Then you're going to decide what characters are in them, who needs to be really built. And the reason I like to do this after I have the beginning and middle and end is because I need to see what characters contribute to the action before I decide how best to build them. Because if I have a character who shows up in the beginning but has nothing to do with the rest of the piece, I might not need to craft them as carefully. Whereas in Bad Haircut, his mom is in the beginning of the piece and at the end. So it's important that we have a little bit of information about her. The cousin is really only in the middle, and yet he is almost entirely the action of the piece. So it's really important that we build him. In Taken for a Ride, we only have 2 characters. So it's not as important to distinguish between them. And it's pretty obvious what the action is. So you have 3 stories. You've given them a beginning, a middle, and an end. And you've isolated what characters are in them. Particularly if you need to figure out which role which characters are playing and how you're going to distinguish them. Once you have all of this, you want to figure out what your conflict is in the piece. Is it a conflict between, as in Taken for a Ride, you and another person? Is the conflict newly developed, or is the conflict arising before, as in Bad Haircut, where the conflict is really the hair, and it is developed by the introduction of the character of the cousin who offers to get the haircut. Whereas in Taken for a Ride, the conflict is introduced in the character who comes along asking for help. So we have our beginning, our middle, and end. We have our characters, and now we're looking for the conflict, which is really to say, is your conflict in the character, or is it in the action and the characters contribute? Now that you have these ingredients, what I would like you to try doing, and this can be done on your own time, is to write out the story. And for your first draft, I don't think you have to try and make it anything. It doesn't have to be funny. You don't even have to think about how you're going to say it out loud. Although eventually it is helpful with storytelling, I think, to read your stories out loud. But as you write it out, that is the opportunity to look for places where you can do some foreshadowing, where you can do some hinting, where you can do some calling back, as in happens in Taken for a Ride a lot. Because as we put these things on the page, we're going to see moments that need to be highlighted, see moments that need to be emphasized or called back to give the greatest sort of narrative punch. Once you have those moments, I think it is a good test sometimes to start by telling the story and then writing it down. With storytelling, we often want to start with how it feels to perform it. So you have 3 ideas for stories. 3 things for the sake of this module, stories that you think can be told with a humorous tone. For all 3 of them, you're going to pick a beginning, a middle, and an end. You're going to develop the characters and the conflict. From there, and you don't have to necessarily do this for all 3. You can do it for whichever one feels strongest to you. You're going to start to write it out, paying attention to where you can hint, call back, or foreshadow. A lot of comedy is developed in the callback, right? In the foreshadowing. In both stories, it sort of ends with referencing the beginning. Once you have 1 story or 2 stories that feel really great, you're going to start to write them out while saying them out loud. And that is going to be sort of the first part of our storytelling exercise, because I think humor is a good way to start dealing with the tonal control of storytelling. And then next week, we're going to discuss fine-tuning of stories. And we're going to listen to some interviews with stand-up comedians who talk about how they decide to tell a joke and what the process is of telling a joke and how you come up with a joke. In the following week, we're going to move away from humor a little bit and talk about when a story doesn't suit a humorous telling. Although humor is kind of everywhere if you want it to be, but there are some stories that you don't feel like you can tell in a funny way, but you still feel like need to be told, and that's important too. Then we're really going to dig into the idea of performing your story, whether that is a humorous story or not, because many different kinds of stories need to be told. They aren't always necessarily all going to be funny. And then hopefully we'll find a way to get some of the stories out in the world. We'll talk about the best way to do that. But I think it's important to listen to stories. So I really recommend checking out The Moth, which also has its podcast. I recommend watching Stand Up, particularly for this little unit, and really paying attention in these things to A, the narrative structure of stories, the beginning, middle, and end, the characters, the conflict, the callbacks, the foreshadowing, and think of these as sort of the ingredients to the storytelling. That is all I have for today. Next week, we are also going to look at writing a story to be told and the differences in that. And we'll be working with sort of highlighting how some of the things that we deal with in speaking stories work or don't work in that medium. And that will be happening next week. Thank you so much for tuning in today.